He inherited an old ranch and thought there was nothing valuable left there. But when he opened the doors of the abandoned barn, what he saw made him freeze in shock. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, and be sure to tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning the letter arrived, the sky above Green Hollow was the color of rusted tin, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth after a night of low rain. Eli Davis stood on the worn wooden porch of his small farmhouse, holding the envelope in both hands as if it might burn him. It was heavy, yellowed at the edges, sealed with an embossed stamp that bore the name of a law firm he had never heard of, Watson, Lee, and Partners. He turned it over a few times, uncertain whether to open it immediately or finish his morning chores first. But the name written across the front in careful ink stopped him cold. To Mr. Elijah Davis, next of kin to George Washington Davis. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 20 years. George Davis had been his mother's older brother, a quiet man with oil-stained hands and the stooped posture of someone who had spent a lifetime leaning over machines. Eli remembered him vaguely from his childhood, a tall figure with a deep voice, always smelling of metal and smoke. His visits were rare, his words fewer still, and after Eli's mother passed away, the man had disappeared completely from the family's life. Eli had assumed he'd either moved north or died alone somewhere out west. And now, a letter from a lawyer said that old George had left him property. He slit the envelope open with the edge of his pocket knife. Inside were two documents. One, a neatly typed legal notice confirming the death of George Washington Davis, dated 6 months earlier. The other, a notarized statement declaring Eli Davis the sole inheritor of his late uncle's land and associated assets in Brookfield County. There was a third sheet, handwritten in blue ink, tucked between the official papers. It contained just one line, in a shaky but deliberate hand. "You'll understand when you see it for yourself." Eli reread that sentence several times, unsure whether it was meant as a riddle or a warning. He looked around at his own tired fields, the pale stalks of corn barely standing after a bad season, the rusting tractor by the barn, the sagging roof of the chicken shed. For years he'd been fighting to keep this place alive, patching leaks, fixing fences, selling livestock at a loss. Maybe, he thought, this inheritance was a second chance, a new start. That afternoon, over coffee at the diner, he mentioned the letter to two men he knew from the grain cooperative. Their reaction was a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Brookfield County?" one of them said, letting out a laugh. "Ain't nothing out there but busted farms and old meth shacks. You sure you want to drive that far for a piece of dirt no one's touched in 30 years? "Could be worth something," Eli replied, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The other man smirked, shaking his head. "They say the land out there's cursed. Government built some tunnels or silos during the war, then sealed them up. Folks went broke trying to dig them open again. You don't need that kind of trouble, Eli. Sell the papers, keep the gas money." Eli didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that in places like Green Hollow, a man like him didn't win arguments. He simply worked harder and kept his dignity. But as he left the diner, their laughter followed him out into the street, echoing in his mind. The letter in his pocket felt heavier than ever. For 3 nights he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the old man, his mother's brother, the smell of grease and coal dust clinging to him, the way his hands shook slightly even when he was still. Why had George chosen him? Why not a neighbor, a friend, or the state? What could possibly be waiting in a forgotten county that someone like his uncle would want preserved? The question grew like a seed in his mind, rooting deeper every hour. By the fourth morning, Eli had decided. He packed a small bag, filled his truck with what gas he could afford, and set off before sunrise. The road out of Green Hollow wound through empty farmland, then thinned into gravel paths lined with birch and pine. The farther he drove, the older everything looked. Barns collapsed into themselves, silos half swallowed by weeds, mailboxes with no names left on them. It felt as though he were driving backward in time. By noon, the sun had burned through the haze, and the land grew rougher. Signs were riddled with bullet holes, and the occasional rusted pickup lay abandoned in the ditch. When he finally saw the faded sign that read Brookfield County Line, he felt the address in the letter led him down a side road so overgrown he almost missed the turn. The path curved between low hills, the gravel giving way to packed dirt, until he came upon a set of crooked wooden gates strung together with barbed wire. The hinges were eaten with rust. A hand-painted sign barely hung from one nail, the letters flaking off but still legible, Davis Ranch. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on dry grass. The place was silent except for the distant hum of insects. The farmhouse stood about 50 yards beyond the gate, small and colorless, its roof sagging like a tired back. To the right were two barns, their doors hanging open like yawning mouths. To the left, at the edge of the property, rose a rocky slope covered in moss and scrub. He pushed through the gate, its rusty squeal echoing through the still air, and walked toward the house. The porch steps creaked beneath his weight. Inside, the air was thick and musty, carrying the scent of rot and dust. A single table sat overturned in the kitchen. A rusted stove crouched in the corner. On one wall, faded family photographs still clung by nails, their edges curled from humidity. He brushed one off. It showed his uncle as a young man, standing beside a rail car, his face stern but proud. Eli explored the barns next. The first held piles of old feed sacks, cracked buckets, and a tractor stripped down to its bones. The second was empty, but for a few rusted tools and a broken wagon wheel. Nothing here suggested value, much less mystery. He was beginning to wonder whether the whole thing had been a mistake when he noticed something unusual. Beyond the barns, halfway up the rocky slope, a shape jutted from the hillside, too geometric to be natural. As he climbed closer, he saw that it wasn't stone at all, but metal. Two massive steel doors, nearly hidden by vines and earth, their surfaces streaked with rust. They looked like the entrance to an old bunker, tall enough for a truck or a train. He touched the surface, feeling the cold metal beneath layers of grime. A faded stenciled number was still visible. B7 Maintenance. Below it, someone had painted words long ago, now barely legible. Keep locked. He stepped back, heart pounding. A bunker here, in the middle of nowhere? Suddenly, the letter made more sense. The secrecy, the strange note from his uncle. This wasn't just a piece of farmland. Whatever lay behind those doors was what George Davis had wanted him to find. Eli returned to the truck as dusk settled, the horizon bleeding into shades of copper and violet. He sat behind the wheel, staring at the bunker until the last light faded. He thought about the men in the diner, their laughter, their easy dismissal. He thought about his uncle's words. You'll understand when you see it for yourself. Now he had seen it, and understanding would not come easily. That night he slept on the old couch inside the house, the wind rattling the broken shutters. Through the cracked window he could see the faint outline of the hillside, the hidden metal doors glinting faintly under the moon. The land felt heavy, watchful, as though holding its breath. In the silence, Eli made a decision without speaking it aloud. He would not sell this place, not yet. Something here had been buried, perhaps forgotten on purpose. But if his uncle had trusted him with it, then he owed it to the man, and to himself, to find out why. The next morning, he would bring tools, clear the vines, and see what waited behind that door of rust and secrecy. Outside, the night deepened, and the fields whispered softly in the wind, as if the earth itself was aware that after all these quiet, empty years, someone had finally come back. The next morning broke pale and heavy, the kind of dawn that made the world seem hushed and undecided. Eli rose early, shaking the stiffness from his limbs after a night spent on the sagging couch. The air inside the farmhouse was cool and stale, filled with the faint odor of mildew and smoke that no open window could clear. Outside, fog rolled low across the pasture, veiling the barns and the slope where the metal doors lay half buried. For a few long moments he stood on the porch, staring toward that patch of rock and steel, and felt as though it were staring back. He brewed coffee on the old propane stove he'd found in the kitchen. The flame hissed uncertainly before catching, and the smell of burnt gas filled the air. As he sipped from a chipped enamel cup, he took stock of the situation. The house was barely standing. The roof leaked in two corners, and mice had claimed the pantry. The barns were in worse shape. The only thing that seemed solid on the property were those heavy doors in the hillside. They didn't belong to a... By mid-morning, the fog lifted, revealing the land in its full decay. The grass rose high as his waist, choking the old fence posts. A dry well stood beside the house, its wooden frame tilted and half collapsed. He walked the perimeter of the ranch, trying to imagine what it had looked like in his uncle's time. There were signs that someone once cared about this place. Stone markers lined an overgrown path. The remnants of a chicken coop sagged near a dead elm, and pieces of farm equipment lay scattered like bones. But everything had the same feeling: neglect, abandonment, the long silence of a place that had forgotten human voices. When he circled back toward the barns, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. His first thought was that maybe someone from the county had come to inspect the property. But as the sound grew closer, two men in a rusted pickup appeared at the edge of the field. The truck stopped a few yards from him, engine idling, and the passenger window rolled down. "You the one who bought old George's place?" the driver asked. He was in his 50s, pale-faced, with sun-scorched skin and a ball cap pulled low. His tone wasn't hostile, exactly, just sharp, the way someone might sound when demanding an explanation. "I didn't buy it," Eli said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Inherited it." The other man laughed, a short, dry sound. "Inherited, huh? Guess he ran out of better options." The words landed harder than they should have, but Eli didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Maybe. Still figuring out what's here." "Well, I'll save you the trouble," the driver said, spitting out the window. "Ain't much. Place has been empty since before my daddy got out the service. Roof's bad, water's bad, soil's bad. County won't even collect trash out here no more. You'd be better off selling it for scrap and getting yourself back to town." Eli didn't respond. The man studied him for a moment, then added in a quieter voice, "Ain't many folks come out here, and those who do, they don't stay long. You'll see why." Then, without another word, he threw the truck into reverse, turned sharply and rumbled off down the road. Dust rose behind them, catching the morning light. Eli stood in silence until the sound faded. The land around him seemed to absorb the echo, swallowing it whole. He looked down at the dry dirt beneath his boots. It was hard-packed, cracked in places. He knelt, scooped a handful, and let it run through his fingers. Lifeless soil. Yet, his uncle had chosen this land to preserve. There had to be a reason. He spent the rest of the morning in the barns. The first was barely standing. The walls leaned inward, and one corner had caved entirely, letting sunlight stream through the broken boards. Inside, old tools lay scattered across the dirt floor, hammers, nails, the twisted frame of a wheelbarrow. A tractor sat in the shadows, nothing but a skeleton of rust and rot. He found no machinery worth saving, no signs of life, only the echo of work done long ago. The second barn, however, held something different. It was larger, sturdier, built partly from concrete instead of wood. The doors were bolted shut, but one hinge had given way, and Eli managed to force it open. Inside was a vast emptiness that smelled faintly of oil and damp earth. There were iron hooks on the walls, a large winch near the back, and a set of tracks carved into the dirt floor. Strange, deliberate tracks, as though something heavy had once been dragged in and out repeatedly. He traced them toward the far end of the barn, where the wall met the slope of the hill outside. There, beneath layers of ivy creeping through a broken window, was another metal panel, smaller than the great doors outside, but built of the same kind of steel. He brushed off the dirt and saw faint stenciled letters so worn he could barely make them out. Only one word was clear: maintenance. The realization came slowly, like a fog lifting. This barn wasn't just a storage shed. It had been connected somehow to the larger structure hidden in the hillside. As he stood there, trying to make sense of it, the hum of an approaching engine reached him again. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the glare. The same truck had returned, but this time another vehicle followed, a red pickup with a younger man driving. They stopped at the gate and waved him over. "You really planning to stay here?" the older driver called out as Eli approached. "Because you might want to know what you're standing on." The younger one, lean and sharp-faced, leaned out the window with a grin. "He means the ground. Ain't just dirt, you know. There's old tunnels under here, war stuff. My granddad said they used to build machines under the hill, engines, maybe weapons. Government shut it down after a cave-in, killed 3 men, whole place." Eli glanced back towards the slope where the main doors loomed, half hidden by brush. "And nobody's opened it since?" "Not that we know of," the older man said. "You'd have to be crazy to try." The younger one smirked. Crazy or stupid, maybe both. They laughed, not cruelly, but with the easy mockery of men who believed the world had already shown them everything worth knowing. Eli smiled politely, thanked them for the warning, and watched them drive away again. Their laughter trailed off down the dusty road. When they were gone, he turned back toward the hillside. The idea of a cave-in lingered in his mind. If it was true, it might explain why his uncle's land had been left to rot. But why not sell it? Why not clear it out years ago? There were too many questions, and the only way to find answers was to look for himself. That evening, as the light thinned, he climbed back up toward the slope. The air had cooled, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. He knelt before the great steel doors and began pulling at the vines that clung to them. The plants tore away easily, their roots snapping. Beneath them, the metal was scarred and pitted with rust. In some places, it had fused with the earth itself. He ran his hand across the seam between the doors and the rock. It was tight, sealed by decades of corrosion, but not unmovable. He found the remnants of a locking mechanism, massive bolts and hinges nearly eaten through. It looked as though someone, long ago, had welded the doors shut from the outside. The notion sent a chill through him. It wasn't nature that had sealed this place. It was intent. Someone had wanted it closed. He stepped back, surveying the area. Around the doors, the hillside formed a shallow basin, almost circular, as though shaped deliberately. A few yards away, half buried under grass, he found an old concrete post with a rusted plaque. The letters were barely visible, but under the grime he could make out a line. Property of the United States Army, 1943. So it had been military. His uncle had worked here, of that much he was now certain. And if George Davis had spent his life tending whatever lay behind those doors, then maybe this land wasn't cursed after all. Maybe it had simply been forgotten. He returned to the farmhouse as twilight fell, the windows glowing faintly orange in the fading light. The road was quiet, the air thick with the hum of crickets. He made another cup of coffee on the stove, sat by the window, and stared out toward the hill. The two men's words replayed in his mind, about danger, about things better left buried. He thought of the laughter at the diner, the disbelief in every man's voice when he'd mentioned his inheritance. For years he'd been on the receiving end of that same tone, the kind that said, "You don't belong here. You're not supposed to succeed." Maybe this place was cursed, but not in the way they thought. Maybe the curse was the belief that nothing here could be saved, that nothing was worth rebuilding. He stayed awake long into the night, thinking about his uncle and the life the man had led in this remote corner of the world. What had George seen here that made him stay after everyone else left? Why had he sealed the entrance instead of destroying it? And why leave it all to him? The questions twisted together, forming something between mystery and responsibility. Before dawn, he stepped outside again. The grass was wet with dew, shining under the faint silver of the moon. From where he stood, the steel doors were just visible through the mist, dark and silent, like the back of a sleeping giant. Eli felt a strange pull then, a quiet certainty that he was standing on the edge of something larger than himself. The locals could mock and warn all they liked, but he knew what he had to do. He would open those doors. He would see what his uncle had protected. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of iron from the hill. It was as if the earth itself had exhaled, answering his resolve. He turned back toward the house, the first thin line of morning already breaking over the ridge. Tomorrow he would bring the tools, the chain, the crowbar. Tomorrow he would force the rust to move. For now, he let the silence settle again over the ranch, the weight of it both oppressive and holy. Somewhere beneath his feet, the past was waiting, sealed in steel and darkness, patient as time itself. The day after his decision, Eli woke with the first light and felt an uncommon sense of determination settle over him. The air was crisp and damp, clinging to his skin as he stepped outside. Mist hung over the field like a ghostly veil, and somewhere beyond the barn, the faint outline of the hillside waited. He had spent most of the night thinking about what he would do, his mind circling back to the same question. Why would a man weld shut a door on his own property and then leave it behind for someone else to find? By morning, he no longer cared about the why. It was the what that mattered now. He filled his truck bed with what tools he had: a crowbar, a sledgehammer, a rusted chain, a set of wrenches, and a few cans of oil. He drove the short distance to the slope and parked in the clearing. Dew clung to every blade of grass. The air was sharp and still, and the only sound came from the distant call of a hawk somewhere high above. Standing before the doors again, he realized just how massive they were, at least 10 feet high and thick as a man's arm. Decades of neglect had turned the steel a dull orange-brown, but it hadn't yielded to time. This was industrial metal, the kind used to seal something important or dangerous. He began by cutting away the vines and brush that blanketed the front. It was slow work. The plants had rooted deep into cracks and crevices. As he cleared, he noticed faint markings etched into the surface, letters and numbers painted once in military stencils. Unit B7, property of U.S. Army. Below it, just visible beneath layers of grime, someone had scratched a date, 1954, a lifetime ago. When he stepped back to catch his breath, a sound startled him, a low hum of an approaching vehicle. He turned and saw dust rising on the road, another truck making its way toward the ranch. For a fleeting moment, he thought the two men from the day before had returned, but as the truck drew nearer, he saw it was older, blue, and driven by a heavy-set man in coveralls. The truck stopped near Eli's, and the man leaned out the window. "You the new owner?" the stranger asked. His voice was rough, but not unkind. Eli nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's right." The man looked past him toward the hillside, squinting. "I was the county inspector here once, long time ago. Didn't think anyone'd ever come back." "What is this place?" Eli asked. "Depot, they called it," the man replied. "During the war, this whole stretch was a repair yard. Brought in locomotives, engines, maybe even ammunition. Your uncle worked here after it shut down. Stubborn old fool, wouldn't leave even when the rest of us packed it in. Why'd they close it? Cave in, I heard. Part of the tunnel collapsed. Killed some men. Government sealed it up and told everyone to forget about it. George, he stayed behind. Said someone had to keep her breathing. Never did say what he meant." The man gave a small shake of his head, then turned the truck around. "Word of advice," he added before leaving. "Some things are buried for a reason." When he drove off, the dust settled slowly, leaving Eli alone again with the door. The words, "keep her breathing," echoed in his mind. What did his uncle mean by that? The place hadn't breathed in decades, yet somehow the air around it felt charged, as if the earth itself held its breath. He attached the chain to the left door and looped the other end around the hitch of his truck. The engine growled as he eased forward, letting the tension build. At first, nothing moved. The chain rattled and groaned, the door shuddering but holding fast. He backed up, tried again and again, until with a shriek like an animal in pain, the hinge gave way a fraction of an inch. Rust flakes showered down like sparks. He kept at it, inch by inch, sweat stinging his eyes, until at last the left door lurched open a foot. A gust of air rushed out, cold, stale, metallic, like the breath of something long dead. He switched off the truck and stood listening. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Slowly, he pried the door wider with the crowbar until he could slip inside. The light from the entrance barely reached past the threshold. The beam of his flashlight cut a narrow path through the dust and darkness. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rust, oil, and mold. His boots echoed faintly as he stepped forward, revealing the edge of a concrete floor that sloped slightly downward. The tunnel widened into a cavernous chamber, larger than any barn, its arched ceiling supported by steel girders. Dust motes floated in the air like tiny ghosts. Then the beam caught something vast and curved in the middle of the room. He took a few steps closer and stopped. A locomotive. It loomed in the darkness like a sleeping beast, half covered in tarps and cobwebs, its iron body mottled with rust but unmistakably whole. The front bore a number plate, 4821, and a faint outline of faded letters that once read C&O Railway. The headlight, clouded with age, stared blindly toward the tunnel's far end. Around it lay the remnants of a workshop, wrenches, steel drums, an air compressor, and several workbenches lined with tools still hanging neatly in. Eli walked slowly around the machine, his flashlight brushing over the details, the massive wheels, the pressure gauges, the brass piping gone green with corrosion. He trailed his hand along the boiler, feeling the texture of rust and cold metal beneath his fingertips. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. At the rear of the chamber stood a small office made of corrugated steel, its door ajar. Inside, shelves of binders and logbooks lined the walls. He pulled one at random. The cover read Maintenance Records, 1952, 1955. He flipped through brittle pages filled with neat, handwritten notes, steam pressure readings, valve replacements, work schedules, and there, in the margin of one page, written in a hand he recognized from the letter, were the words G.W. Davis. His uncle had worked here, not as a caretaker, but as a mechanic, one of the men who had kept these engines alive. The realization struck him with a strange mix of pride and grief. Whatever this place was, it had been his uncle's world, his secret, his burden, and perhaps his refuge. He found more papers, payroll slips, ration stubs, even a photograph of several men standing in front of the same locomotive. They were young, covered in grease, smiling in that unguarded way of people who didn't yet know their time was about to end. His uncle was among them, second from the left, holding a wrench like a badge of honor. On the back of the photo, scrawled in faded pencil, were the words, "We built this to last forever." Eli lingered over that line. It sounded less like pride and more like a promise. He explored deeper into the tunnel, finding two smaller side chambers filled with crates and spare parts. Many were stamped with serial numbers and codes, all dated from the 1940s and 50s. Some bore the insignia of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. Whatever operation this had been, it wasn't just for civilian use. Perhaps the rumors of government secrecy were true after all. Near the far wall, a section of the ceiling had partially collapsed, blocking what appeared to be another passageway. Broken beams jutted out from the rubble, and the remains of old tracks vanished into the debris. He crouched down, brushing away dust until he uncovered a faint metal sign half buried in the dirt. It read, "Exit Track, Line B." The words were nearly illegible, but their meaning was clear. This locomotive hadn't been meant to stay underground. There had been a way out once, a track that led somewhere beyond the hill. As he rose, his flashlight beam fell on something carved into the concrete beside the sign. At first, he thought it was graffiti, but when he looked closer, he saw letters, initials perhaps, etched with a pocket knife. GWD. His uncle's mark again, deep and deliberate. He stood there for a long time, the weight of the discovery pressing on him. It was as though his uncle had left breadcrumbs through the years, waiting for someone to find them. A sealed door, a locomotive, initials in stone, it all felt deliberate. But deliberate toward what end? Eli made his way back to the main chamber, where the locomotive stood silent and solemn in the half-light. He could almost imagine the clang of tools, the hiss of steam, the voices of men shouting over the roar of engines. It wasn't difficult to picture his uncle here, younger and stronger, sleeves rolled up, grease smeared across his forearms. The air might have been thick with smoke and heat then, alive with purpose. Now it was still as a tomb. He sat on a crate and let the beam of his flashlight rest on the locomotive's side. A thin layer of dust swirled in the air. He thought of the phrase, "keep her breathing," and realized what it might mean. This engine had been his uncle's life, his companion, his creation, maybe even his salvation. Perhaps, in his own way, George Davis had kept her alive all these years, tending to her in secret, maintaining the last piece of a world that everyone else had abandoned. When he finally stepped outside, the light nearly blinded him. The sky had cleared, and the afternoon sun glared down over the fields. He turned to look once more at the gaping mouth of the tunnel, now exposed for the first time in decades. The door hung crooked on its hinges, one side open to the wind. He thought of closing it again, but something inside him rebelled at the idea. The world beyond that door might have forgotten, but he hadn't. He locked the chain around the handles loosely, not to seal it, but to mark it as his. This place no longer belonged to the army, or to the ghosts of war. It belonged to him now. As he drove back toward the farmhouse, the sun dipped low, setting the grass ablaze in amber light. From the road, he could just make out the dark silhouette of the locomotive hidden inside the hill. That night, sleep came slowly. When it did, he dreamed of iron wheels turning in the dark, of fire lighting the inside of a steel chamber, of his uncle's hands steady on the controls. Somewhere, deep beneath the ranch, something had stirred awake again. In the quiet hours before dawn, Eli woke to the faint echo of a sound that shouldn't have been there, a deep metallic groan, distant yet unmistakable, like the memory of machinery shifting after a long rest. He sat up, heart hammering, listening to the silence that followed. Then he smiled faintly to himself. The ranch, it seemed, was beginning to breathe again. The following morning arrived gray and quiet, the sky low and swollen with the promise of rain. Eli sat at the table in his uncle's kitchen, the old locomotive logbook open before him, a half-empty mug of coffee gone cold by his hand. The discovery of the underground chamber had kept him awake most of the night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the massive silhouette of the engine standing in the dark like a buried monument waiting for light. There was something about that place, its stillness, its strange preservation, that felt sacred, as if time itself had been paused beneath the earth. He knew what he had to do, though he hadn't yet dared to say it aloud. He would bring the machine back to life. It was a ridiculous thought. The locals would have laughed, the same way they had laughed when he told them about inheriting the ranch. A man alone, without money, tools, or training, restoring a locomotive that had been sealed in a bunker for half a century. They would call him a fool. Yet that didn't matter. The moment he'd touched the side of that iron beast, he'd felt a pulse beneath the rust, a kind of sleeping heartbeat that waited only for someone stubborn enough to wake it. He spent the first half of the day clearing the entrance properly. The left door now opened easily enough, but the right one remained wedged deep in the earth, its hinges locked tight with age. Eli oiled them, hammered at them, cursed them, then finally attached the chain again and used the truck to pull. The old steel shrieked and shuddered, and at last it gave way, swinging open to reveal the full mouth of the tunnel. A wave of stale air rolled out, heavy and cold, carrying the faint scent of oil and dust that had lain undisturbed for decades. By afternoon, The sky broke open and rain began to fall. It came slow at first, then harder, drumming against the truck and the metal doors. Eli stood at the threshold, soaked to the bone, staring into the darkness. The water ran down his face and mixed with the grime on his hands, streaking the skin like old soot. The machine inside was barely visible in the gloom, but its shape was unmistakable. It wasn't just an engine. It was a relic, a survivor of a forgotten world, and somehow it was now his responsibility. That night, as lightning cracked in the distance, he returned to the farmhouse and began rummaging through his uncle's belongings. In a chest beneath the bed, he found a stack of notebooks wrapped in a canvas cloth. Most were filled with mechanical sketches, numbers, and equations he couldn't follow. But the final one was different. Its first page bore a simple line written in his uncle's uneven script. "If she breathes again, the land will follow." Eli stared at the words, his heart pounding. He didn't know what they meant, metaphor, superstition, or prophecy, but they were enough. George Davis had spent his final years tending to something that no one else cared about. And if that work had mattered to him, then it would matter to Eli too. He began the restoration the next morning. The first step was to clean. He set up floodlights from the truck's battery, and their harsh white glow filled the chamber with strange shadows. Dust hung thick in the air as he swept and scraped, uncovering the outlines of the old tracks, the piles of tools, the rusted compressor. He climbed into the cab of the locomotive and found the controls intact, though every lever was stiff with corrosion. The seat, where his uncle must have once sat, was covered in a film of dust so thick it looked like ash. He wiped it clean with his sleeve and sat down. For a long while, he didn't move. The view from the cab faced the sealed end of the tunnel, where a faint crack of daylight shone through the open doors. The sound of rain from outside echoed faintly, rhythmic and calm. It was the sound of the world waiting. Eli worked for days. He cleaned the boiler, drained what was left of the old oil, and hauled away the rotted wooden crates that cluttered the floor. He found more of his uncle's notes scattered among the tools, lists. One note caught his attention. Pressure lines still intact, never broke, needs new seals, water, and heat. Another read, "The earth here feeds her. Don't let her die." It was poetic in a strange, mechanical way. He began making runs into town, buying what few supplies he could afford: wire brushes, grease, steel patches, bolts, and small cans of paint. The man at the hardware store grew curious after the third visit. "You fixing up something out there?" he asked casually. "Just keeping busy," Eli said. The man smirked. "Busy's one word for it. Folks out that way don't last long. Hard to grow anything but weeds." Eli didn't reply. He paid in cash and left. The whispers began soon after, people wondering what the stranger with the old truck was doing up in Brookfield, why he kept hauling metal and oil down a dead-end road. Some said he was crazy, chasing ghosts. Others said he was digging for something he shouldn't. By the end of the second week, the locomotive's surfaces had begun to shine faintly beneath the grime. The once dull brass valves gleamed again under the light, and the wheels, though still stiff, looked less like relics and more like instruments waiting for a hand to guide them. The deeper Eli worked, the more he felt a strange sense of companionship, as if his uncle's spirit lingered somewhere in the shadows, watching over his progress. But the ranch wasn't without its dangers. Twice he found the door to the tunnel unlatched in the morning when he was sure he'd secured it the night before. Once, a pile of tools he'd left neatly stacked had been scattered across the floor as though kicked aside in anger, and one evening, as he was closing up for the night, he noticed footprints in the mud outside, fresh ones, smaller than his, leading from the road toward the entrance and back again. He knew then that the locals had started paying closer attention. Still, he didn't stop. If anything, their curiosity only fueled him. He began rebuilding the boiler line, clearing the old pipes that had been clogged with sediment. He set up a small workbench near the engine and began hand-polishing the brass gauges, each one marked with numbers that spoke of a time when precision meant survival. His uncle's old tattered notebook rarely left his side now. It had become a kind of manual, though much of it was cryptic. One line especially haunted him. "When she breathes, the ground will open." He tried not to think about what that might mean. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch and watch the land. The more he worked inside the hill, the more he thought he could feel subtle changes outside it. The air seemed less stagnant. The grass, once brittle and brown, now held a faint sheen of green. A small trickle of water had begun to flow again from the old well, something that hadn't happened in years. It could have been coincidence, but Eli couldn't shake the thought that the place was responding to his efforts, as though the land itself had been waiting, dormant, for the rhythm of human hands again. One night, during a storm, lightning illuminated the valley in violent flashes, and, in each burst of light, the metal doors of the tunnel seemed to glow. Eli stood under the rain, watching the rivulets of water streaming down the steel surface, and he swore he felt the faintest vibration beneath his boots, so slight it could have been his imagination. The earth was trembling, softly, like something turning in its sleep. He doubled his efforts in the days that followed. He replaced the cracked pipes with new fittings, rigged a temporary fuel line, and cleaned the firebox until it gleamed. Each task brought him closer to the impossible. The work was lonely, punishing, and relentless. His hands blistered, his back ached, but there was a strange joy in it, too. The act of rebuilding something that had once mattered gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. A week later, he found a sealed envelope tucked inside the lining of the locomotive's cab. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. His uncle's. Inside was a single folded page, stained and brittle. It read, "If you're reading this, then you've done what I couldn't. She's meant to move again, but only when the road is ready. Don't rush her. When the land listens, she'll answer." Eli read it twice, then tucked it into his pocket. The message was vague, but it felt like guidance all the same. His uncle had left him not just a machine, but a conversation, a dialogue between man, memory, and the earth itself. He began working longer hours, often past midnight. The old lamps cast trembling shadows across the curved walls, and the smell of hot metal and oil became his constant companion. He didn't notice at first how much the air inside had changed, warmer now, less stale. The silence no longer felt empty but alive, filled with faint echoes that could have been his imagination. The metallic. Outside, the rain ceased and the fields began to dry. Birds returned to the trees by the road, and one morning, for the first time since his arrival, Eli saw a deer standing at the edge of the pasture. It watched him quietly, unafraid, before vanishing back into the woods. The sight filled him with a quiet, inexplicable hope. By the end of the month, the restoration was almost complete. The locomotive stood like a monument resurrected, its brass fittings polished, its steel frame free of corrosion. It wasn't ready to run yet, not without water and fire, but it was whole again, awake in form, if not yet in motion. One evening, as Eli prepared to leave, he looked around the chamber and realized how much had changed. The dust was gone, the air clear. Even the walls seemed brighter, as though the light itself had deepened. The tunnel no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a heartbeat, steady and waiting. He stood before the machine, resting a hand on the cool steel of its flank. "Tomorrow," he said softly, though there was no one there to hear. When he stepped outside, the sky was clear, the first stars appearing above the ridge. The grass shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. Somewhere beneath his feet, the old track stretched into darkness, leading to a destination lost to time. But for the first time since inheriting the ranch, Eli didn't feel like an intruder in a forgotten place. He felt like a keeper of something ancient, something waiting to be reborn. The morning that followed was colder than usual, a brittle stillness hanging in the air that carried the scent of iron and dust. Eli woke before sunrise, his mind already moving through the tasks ahead. For weeks, his days had fallen into rhythm, hours of silence and sweat, the scrape of metal, the smell of oil and rust, and yet today felt different. The locomotive now stood complete in its hollow like a dormant god, every bolt and pipe cleaned, every lever ready. The restoration had filled his waking hours, but something larger waited beyond it. The sealed end of the tunnel, that mass of earth and stone where the old track vanished, had been calling to him since the first day he stepped inside. It was time to see where it led. The previous night, he had reread his uncle's last letter, the one that said, "She's meant to move again, but only when the road is ready." Those words had lodged in his chest like a stone. He knew what they meant now. His uncle had left the machine unfinished because the way out had been destroyed. Without a path, the locomotive was only a monument to failure. To complete the promise, Eli would have to reopen the buried line. He gathered his tools, a shovel, a pickaxe, a set of lanterns, and a crowbar. The damp air clung to his skin as he entered the tunnel. The lights he'd strung along the walls flickered weakly, throwing long, trembling shadows across the steel body of the train. It seemed to watch him as he passed, the polished brass of its gauges catching glints of the lantern flame. He touched the side of the boiler briefly before walking to the far end where the collapse began. The rubble there had once looked impenetrable, but he could see now that time had softened it. The wood beams splintered, the rock cracked and loose in places. Somewhere behind that wall of debris, he was certain, lay the rest of the line. He began to dig. The sound of the pickaxe echoed sharply off the walls, ringing through the chamber like a bell. Dust filled the air, coating his throat, but he pressed on. Hours passed unnoticed. Every swing of the tool felt like a conversation with the earth itself, slow, stubborn, but alive. The deeper he went, the stronger the smell of old oil and damp metal became, until he struck something hollow. He cleared the dirt with his hands and revealed the edge of a rusted rail, still bolted to its ties. His heart pounded. The track didn't end here. It continued beneath the collapse. The tunnel hadn't died, it had only been sleeping. By dusk, he had opened a narrow crawl space that led beyond the blockage. He lit another lantern, tied it to his belt, and pushed through. The passage beyond was low and rough, the air stale and cool. When he emerged on the other side, he found himself in another chamber, smaller but unmistakably built for the same purpose. The rails curved gently toward what looked like a ramp, ascending toward a point of faint, natural light high above. The exit had been sealed long ago with heavy timber. He stood there for a long time, breathing the air, which carried the scent of grass and sunlight. The realization that the outside world lay only a few yards away filled him with a wild, disbelieving joy. His uncle had been right. There had been a second way out, one that time and rumor had buried. If he could clear it, the locomotive could move again, even if only a short distance. He climbed back through the breach, his body aching, and by nightfall he had drawn a rough map of the lower line. The next few days became a blur of work. He cleared rubble, reinforced weak beams with scavenged planks, and dug drainage trenches to keep the passage dry. The effort was grueling, but he didn't stop. He ate little, slept less, and thought often of his uncle. How many years the old man must have worked alone down here, tending this secret world no one else cared to remember. On the 5th day, while moving a pile of loose rocks, Eli unearthed something unexpected. A wooden box, about the size of a crate, buried near the base of the ramp. It was heavy, sealed with metal latches, rusted nearly shut. When he finally pried it open, he found a collection of papers, each carefully folded, their ink faded but legible. Most were blueprints, technical drawings of the locomotive, the tunnel network, and what appeared to be a map of the surrounding land. But at the bottom of the stack lay something stranger, a hand-drawn diagram that wasn't mechanical at all. It depicted the valley, the riverbed, and the ranch above, with lines radiating outward from the location of the tunnel like veins from a heart. At the center, his uncle had written a single phrase in thick, deliberate letters. The line feeds the land. Eli didn't understand, not entirely, but he felt the weight of the words. Maybe his uncle had believed that the tunnel's construction had changed something underground, that it had altered the water flow or the soil somehow. Maybe that was why the ground had died after the train stopped running. Or maybe the old man had meant it figuratively. That movement, work, creation, life, was what sustained this place. Whatever the truth, Eli knew one thing. He couldn't stop now. He cleared the last of the rubble by the end of the week. The passage was open from the main chamber to the ramp, the rails shining faintly beneath layers of dust. Above, the sealed exit awaited, a barrier of wood and stone that he now knew how to dismantle. He brought up his generator and began cutting through the boards. The saw bit into the timber with a steady, angry whine. Light poured in through widening cracks, sharp and blinding after so many days underground. When the final board gave way, the air rushed in, warm, clean, filled with the scent of earth and rain. For the first time in over half a century, sunlight touched the inside of the tunnel. He stepped outside and found himself standing at the foot of a low hillside on the far side of the ranch. The old rail bed continued for several yards before vanishing beneath grass and soil, but it was there, an unbroken line of steel, half buried yet intact. From this vantage point, the valley spread out before him, a wide expanse of faded green and brown, the farmhouse a small shape in the distance. It was quiet, peaceful, but no longer dead. He could hear insects buzzing, the rustle of wind through the weeds. Somewhere nearby, water trickled faintly through the dry creek bed that had lain silent for years. As he stood there, catching his breath, he heard an engine approach. He turned to see the same red pickup from before stopping near the edge of the field. 2 men stepped out, the same pair who had mocked him weeks earlier. They walked toward him slowly, eyes narrowed against the light. "You're still here," the older one said, almost in disbelief. "Thought you'd have given up by now." Eli didn't answer. His clothes were covered in dirt, his hands blistered, but his eyes were bright. The younger man pointed toward the open tunnel behind him. You opened that yourself?" "Just clearing what was already there," Eli said evenly. The men exchanged glances. The older one shook his head. "You don't know what you're messing with. They sealed that for a reason." "Maybe," Eli replied, "but it's my land now, my choice." The younger man's mouth twisted. "You think this'll make you rich? There's nothing down there but ghosts." Eli's gaze didn't waver. "Then I'll let them rest in the light." The men didn't respond. After a moment, they turned and left, the pickup's tires spinning up dust as it roared away. Eli watched them go, the echo of their words fading into the wind. He felt neither anger nor fear. What he felt instead was a kind of calm. That evening, he returned to the chamber and stood before the locomotive once more. The air inside was warmer now, stirred by the faint draft from the open tunnel. The polished surfaces of the engine reflected the light like liquid fire. It looked alive, waiting. He placed his hand on the brass handle of the throttle, then withdrew it slowly. Not yet. The road was open, but there was more to do. He needed to test the rails, clear the weeds from the path above, and ensure the line could bear the weight of steel again. He spent the following days walking the length of the track beyond the hillside, tracing where it once wound through the valley. Much of it was gone, reclaimed by soil and roots, but in places the ties still showed, gray and solid beneath the grass. He found the remains of a bridge at the far end, a few wooden beams, and a single rusted girder crossing a shallow gully. The structure had collapsed long ago, but the stones beneath it were damp, the earth soft. When he knelt to touch it, water pooled beneath his fingers. The underground stream had returned. The line truly did feed the land. He smiled then, not because he fully understood, but because he felt it, the connection his uncle had spoken of. Restoring the tunnel hadn't just unearthed a machine, it had awakened the valley itself. Each swing of his pickaxe, each bolt turned, had been like a heartbeat echoing through the ground. That night, he sat outside under the stars, the air cool and fragrant. The ranch no longer felt forsaken. The well by the house held water again, and the grass near the fence had begun to grow in faint green tufts. He thought of the men who had mocked him, of the silence that had once ruled this place, and of the sound he would soon hear, the roar of an engine, the hiss of steam, the rattle of wheels on rails. Tomorrow he would prepare the boiler and gather the last supplies. Tomorrow he would test the line. The earth had given its answer, and the way was ready. As he stood to head back inside, a breeze swept through the valley, carrying the scent of rain and the faint rhythmic sound of metal echoing from the tunnel. He paused, listening. It came again, a slow, hollow pulse, deep and distant, like the first breath of something waking. He turned toward the dark mouth of the tunnel, the faint light glimmering off the polished brass of the engine within, and he whispered to the night, half in awe and half in promise, "Soon." Dawn arrived with a pale and trembling light that slid slowly across the hills, touching the rusted fences and the distant treetops with a faint golden shimmer. Eli had not slept that night. He had sat for hours on the porch, watching the horizon darken and brighten again, waiting for the moment when the world would wake with him. The line was ready. The tunnel had been cleared, the rails freed, and the great engine inside the hill stood waiting in silence, polished and whole. It had been half a lifetime since those wheels had turned, and yet he felt as if the machine had been listening all this time, waiting for a single word, a single spark to bring it back to life. He walked toward the tunnel entrance, boots sinking slightly in the wet grass. The morning air was sharp with dew, carrying the faint smell of oil that seemed to drift from the open mouth of the hill. Inside, the generator lights cast steady cones of white along the walls, their glow reflecting off the brass and steel of the locomotive. It looked magnificent now, the result of months of work, its body dark and clean, the rivets gleaming faintly, the nameplate restored. On the side, beneath the number 4821, he had painted two small letters with careful strokes. GD, his uncle's initials. He climbed into the cab, running his hand over the levers and gauges. Everything was in place. The new seals, the refitted pipes, the patched boiler. He could almost feel his uncle's hands overlapping his, steady and sure, guiding him through motions that had not been performed since before Eli was born. He whispered quietly, "Let's see if you still remember." The first attempt was hesitant. He checked the valves, the water line, the pressure gauge. He turned the fuel line open, hearing the faint hiss of liquid flow. He had rigged an external feed from a tank outside, and the sound of it was strangely comforting, like the heartbeat of a patient waking from sleep. When he struck the ignition, the first few sparks failed, producing only a hollow clank and a soft exhale of smoke. He waited, adjusted, tried again. This time, the fire caught. A muted roar filled the chamber as flame flared inside the furnace. Heat spread slowly through the steel, and the boiler began to tick faintly as it expanded. He moved about the chamber, checking each joint, feeling for leaks. The smell of burning oil and hot metal filled the air, mixing with the damp scent of the earth. It was as if two worlds were colliding, the cold stillness of buried years and the bright, furious energy of life returning. The pressure needle began to rise. He watched it, pulse quickening. When it reached the threshold marked in red in his uncle's notes, he climbed back into the cab. His palms were slick with sweat, but his mind was calm. He released the brake slowly. Nothing happened. For a long moment, there was only the hiss of steam. Then, with a groan that echoed through the tunnel like thunder, the wheels shifted a fraction. The steel groaned again, the weight of decades straining against rust and inertia. Eli pressed gently on the throttle. The engine shuddered, exhaled a deep plume of steam, and rolled forward 1 inch, then another. The screech of metal on metal filled the chamber, the rails vibrating under the weight. The locomotive was moving. Eli felt something inside him break open. He laughed, quietly at first, then with disbelief. The massive shape crept forward, clearing the shadows of the tunnel and into the light that streamed from the reopened exit. The moment the first beam of morning sun touched its steel flank, a white burst of steam erupted from the vent, catching the light like breath turning to gold. The sound filled the valley, a deep, sonorous whistle that rose and carried over the hills. It was the first time in half a century that anyone in Brookfield had heard that sound, and it seemed to wake the land itself. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling through the grass. Birds scattered from the trees, circling overhead as if startled by the noise. Eli climbed down, watching in awe as the train continued to roll, inch by inch, along the short stretch of rail he had cleared. The movement stirred the ground, sending vibrations through the soil, and as he stood there, he noticed something else. A glimmer of water trickling from the base of the hill where the old drainage ditch lay. It was faint at first, a single thread of silver cutting through the mud, but it grew stronger, spreading into a narrow stream. The valley was breathing again. He worked through the day, adjusting the engine, cleaning soot from the boiler door, refilling water. The sound of the machine became steadier, more confident. the hiss of steam turning rhythmic. By afternoon, the air outside was filled with it, a low, constant hum that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. He didn't notice the men watching from the road until much later. The same pickup truck appeared near the gate, and this time there were more of them. 3 trucks in total, a small crowd of men standing by the fence, staring in disbelief. Their laughter was gone. The engine's voice had silenced all mockery. Eli didn't wave. He kept working, his hands black with soot, his shirt clinging to his back. The men whispered among themselves, but did not approach. They stayed until sunset, then left quietly, their faces pale and thoughtful. As darkness fell, Eli extinguished the lamps inside the tunnel. The glow from the furnace remained, a soft, pulsing light that painted the walls amber. He sat near the opening, looking out across the land. The stream that had begun that morning now ran clearly across the field, its path tracing the old drainage route toward the creek bed beyond. The grass along its edges already seemed darker, richer. He didn't understand the science of it, but he didn't need to. His uncle's words had been true in their own way. When the machine breathed, the land would follow. The following morning, he woke to the sound of knocking at his door. When he opened it, a woman stood there, older, with a weathered face and gray hair tied in a scarf. She introduced herself as Mrs. Carter, from the neighboring county. She had heard the whistle, she said, and thought it must be a dream. Her father had worked on the rail line decades ago. When she saw the open gate and the column of steam rising from the hill, she had driven out to see for herself. Her voice trembled as she looked past him toward the tunnel. "My daddy used to talk about that sound," she whispered. "Said it meant the valley was alive." Eli felt something tighten in his chest. "It's alive again," he said simply. She stayed for a while, asking about his uncle, sharing stories of the old days, how George Davis had been one of the last mechanics to stay after the others left, how he used to fix farm tools for people even when he had no money for himself. Before leaving, she pressed his hand and said, After she left, others began to come. Farmers from nearby fields, drivers passing through, people who had grown up hearing rumors of a hidden train beneath the hills. They came to see the impossible thing, the engine that had come back to life, the ranch where grass was growing again. Eli didn't charge anyone, didn't make speeches. He simply let them stand by the entrance and watch as the locomotive's breath filled the valley, but not everyone was pleased. Late that evening, as the last visitors left, he found a note nailed to his fence post. The handwriting was jagged and angry. "Stop before you bring trouble. Some things should stay buried." There was no name. He burned the note without a word, watching the paper curl and turn to ash. The following days passed in a blur of work and watchfulness. He repaired the old rails leading farther into the valley, clearing the path toward where the bridge had once been. Each night, he lit the furnace and let the train breathe, and each morning the land seemed greener. It was subtle at first, the shimmer of life in the weeds, the return of insects, the way the air smelled fresher, but it was real. He could see it, feel it, even hear it in the quiet hum beneath his boots. And then came the day he was ready for the first true run. He filled the boiler to capacity, checked every valve twice, and stood in the cab as the fire roared. The steam built quickly, the pressure gauge trembling at the edge of the red mark. He released the brake, eased the throttle forward, and the engine responded with a deep, rolling growl. Slowly, the wheels began to turn again. The locomotive moved down the line, out of the tunnel, across the open field. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder, reverberating against the hills. Eli leaned out the window, the wind whipping his face, the heat from the furnace behind him. The valley stretched before him, golden in the afternoon light, the rails glinting faintly beneath the grass. The machine moved with purpose, its rhythm steady and powerful, every turn of the wheels a heartbeat echoing across the land. When he finally stopped the engine near the end of the line, he climbed down and stood in silence. The ground beneath his boots felt warm. The stream beside the track flowed strong now, clear and fast, and beyond it, in the low fields, new shoots of grass swayed in the breeze. The transformation was undeniable. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, he sat on the hill and watched the smoke from the locomotive drift upward in long gray ribbons. He thought of his uncle, of the years the man had spent alone keeping this secret alive, and he understood now why George had never sold the land, why he had left it only to him. This was never just about a machine. It was about legacy, about proving that what the world abandons can still be saved, that life waits quietly beneath decay, needing only one man's stubbornness to rise again. When darkness fell, Eli walked back to the tunnel, the faint light of the furnace flickering inside. He paused at the threshold, hand resting on the cold steel of the door, and whispered, "Thank you." The wind answered softly, carrying the scent of rain and oil. Somewhere, deep in the valley, a whistle sounded, a long, low cry that faded into the night, neither mournful nor triumphant, but eternal. The land slept, but it was no longer dead. When morning came, the valley was no longer the same. The first light fell over the fields in soft ripples, shimmering on the thin stream that now wound like a silver scar through the land. Birds that had long vanished from this part of the country had returned, their cries echoing faintly above the barn roofs. The air itself felt newer, cleaner, as though something unseen had washed through during the night. Eli stood outside the tunnel with his coffee in hand, gazing across the field where the locomotive rested, its black frame glistening with dew. The previous day's run had left the soil trembling long after the engine stopped. He could still feel the hum of it under his feet, a quiet rhythm that seemed to beat in time with his own heart. The story of what had happened spread faster than he imagined. By midday, several trucks appeared on the dirt road, people stepping out with the curious air of those who come to see a miracle but expect a trick. They were farmers, old families who had lived in Brookfield County all their lives, people who remembered the train only as rumor. They stood by the fence in silence, watching as Eli oiled the wheels and checked the valves. One man, white-bearded and stooped, finally broke the stillness. "My father used to tell me that engine hauled the grain for this valley," he said. Eli didn't look up from his work, but he allowed himself a faint smile. "Seems your father knew something the rest of us forgot." By evening, the small crowd had grown. Some offered to help repair the rails beyond the creek. Others brought water, tools, food. A kind of shared energy filled the air, the sense that something bigger than one man's stubbornness was taking shape. It was as though the valley itself had been waiting for someone to take the first step, and now, seeing that it could be done, the people were following. The next few days unfolded like a dream. Each morning, the whistle of the locomotive echoed across the hills, and with each run, the changes became more visible. The fields began to green again, not with magic, but with the slow, persistent return of moisture and life. The stream widened into a narrow riverbed. The old well by the house filled to its brim. The farmers who had abandoned their nearby plots returned to inspect their land and found it softer, darker, ready to yield again. Even the air smelled different, less like dust, more like rain and iron. Eli worked tirelessly, his body sore, his hands rough, but his spirit clearer than it had ever been. Every night he would sit by the tunnel entrance and watch the furnace's glow fading within, that faint orange pulse reminding him that his uncle's heart still beat inside this machine. Sometimes, when the night was very quiet, he could almost hear a second heartbeat beneath the rumble of the cooling metal, as though the land and the locomotive shared one pulse. The people who had mocked him now came with questions instead of laughter. The older man with the ball cap who had once told him to sell the ranch stood awkwardly by his fence one morning. "Didn't think you'd pull it off," he admitted. "Place looks different." His tone carried no bitterness now, only uneasy respect. "You need a hand laying the next section of track, just say the word." Eli nodded. "I might take you up on that." The transformation of the valley drew the attention of more than just locals. A journalist from the regional paper arrived with a camera, asking to photograph the man who made a dead train run again. Eli allowed it reluctantly, though the attention made him uneasy. The article appeared 2 days later under the headline, "The Engine That Revived a Forgotten County." After that, people he'd never seen before began showing up. Some brought children, others carried notebooks or cameras. They asked about the story, about George Davis, about how the machine could still work after so many decades. Eli told them only part of the truth, that his uncle had kept it in good condition, that he'd found old manuals and followed them, that perhaps he'd just gotten lucky. But he didn't speak of the things that couldn't be explained. The way the ground had softened when the engine ran, the way the stream had returned, the way life itself seemed to follow the rhythm of the rails. One evening, as he cleaned the cab, he noticed something odd. The firebox door, which he always kept latched, stood slightly ajar. Inside, tucked behind a loose metal panel, was a small leather pouch blackened with soot. He pulled it out carefully and untied the string that held it shut. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, brittle with age. It was a letter written in his uncle's unmistakable handwriting. "Eli," it began, "if you found this, then you've already done what I never could. I spent half my life trying to bring her back, but I didn't understand what she really was. She was never just a machine. The line beneath this valley was built on something older, something the Army never understood. When the engines stopped, the water dried. When the wheels turned, the ground breathed. They thought it was superstition, but I've seen it with my own eyes. You will too. This land doesn't need men to own it. It needs men to listen. Promise me you'll never sell it. Promise you'll keep her moving." Eli read the letter 3 times before the meaning sank in. The line between legend and truth had blurred long ago, but his uncle had believed every word of it. And now, standing there with the letter trembling in his hands, Eli realized that he did too. Everything he'd seen, the river returning, the fields awakening, it wasn't coincidence. The land and the machine were part of each other, bound in a way that defied explanation but demanded respect. His uncle hadn't been protecting a secret. He'd been protecting a balance. He placed the letter back into its pouch and tucked it into his jacket. The words stayed with him as he stepped outside. The evening air was cool, the sky streaked with violet. The fields shimmered faintly in the dying light. He walked toward the stream. It felt alive, quick and restless. Above him, the low hum of the cooling locomotive rolled softly through the ground. He could almost hear George's voice in it, a deep, steady murmur, as if the old man were still there, guiding him. The following weeks brought more change. The county board sent surveyors to inspect the property, talking about reopening the old supply line, maybe turning the site into a heritage attraction. But Eli refused the idea of selling or sharing control. "This place isn't for show," he told them. "It's working land. It's alive again, and I intend to keep it that way." The officials frowned, muttered about permits, but something in his voice discouraged argument. The valley continued to heal. Trees that had been gray and brittle now showed buds of green. The birds built nests in the rafters of the barn. The farmers replanted their fields, and for the first time in decades, the ground accepted the seed. It was as though the earth itself had forgiven them. And then came a quiet evening when the air felt heavy with memory. Eli had just finished checking the boiler when he noticed a faint glimmer near the far wall of the tunnel. He followed it, expecting to find the reflection of his lamp, but what he saw stopped him cold. The light came from a seam in the wall, narrow, deliberate, and old. He pressed his hand against it, and a small section of stone shifted inward with a grinding sound. Behind it lay a hidden compartment, no larger than a closet. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a metal box. He carried it to the workbench and opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, old and grainy, showing the construction of the tunnel, men in military uniforms, and George Davis among them, younger but unmistakable. Beneath the photographs were two small journals filled with technical sketches and notes written in a precise hand. One page stood out, a drawing of the valley from above, marked with faint circular lines radiating outward from the tunnel, much like the diagram he had found weeks earlier. At the center, his uncle had written one sentence: "The heart must keep beating." Eli understood then that his uncle had not been alone in his work. The others had known, perhaps not everything, but enough. They had built the railway not merely for transport, but to sustain something deep below, something older than their machines. And when they had sealed the doors after the collapse, they hadn't buried a weapon or a secret project. They had buried life itself. That night, Eli climbed into the cab of the locomotive once more. He lit the furnace, opened the throttle, and let the machine breathe. The sound filled the valley again, rising and falling like the tide. He watched the pressure gauge climb, the firebox glow, the smoke pour from the stack into the night sky. As the first whistle rang out, he felt a deep, resonant pulse beneath the floor, faint but unmistakable, like the echo of a giant heartbeat far below the earth. The sound rolled through the hills, carrying with it a warmth that spread through the ground, into the fields, into the water. When the whistle faded, he stepped outside. The stars above seemed brighter now, the wind warmer. He could see lights flickering from distant farmhouses where people had begun to settle again. The valley was alive in every sense of the word. In the days that followed, life settled into a steady rhythm. The engine no longer sat idle. Eli ran it once every dawn, a ritual of motion and renewal. The locals came to call it the morning song. Children would wait by the fence just to hear the whistle echo across the hills. The once desolate county began to stir with quiet prosperity. People said it was luck, that good soil had simply returned, but those who had been there from the beginning knew better. They knew the truth lived beneath their feet, carried by the iron heart of a machine and the will of one man who refused to give up. Eli never sought fame or fortune for it. He stayed on the ranch, maintaining the engine, repairing the rails, watching the valley thrive. And sometimes when the sun set just right and the air shimmered with heat, he could almost see his uncle standing beside him at the tunnel's mouth, cap pulled low, hands on his hips, nodding in quiet approval. Years later, when Eli was an old man himself, the locals would still tell the story of the black engine of Brookfield, the train that brought water back to the land, the machine that woke the valley from its sleep. Some said it was a miracle, others that it was just a clever mechanic's work. But those who had stood close enough to feel the ground tremble beneath their boots, who had seen the light flicker along the road, and on nights when the wind blew from the south, carrying the faint echo of a distant whistle, they would look toward the hills and remember that the heart still beat beneath the earth, just as George Davis had promised, and just as his nephew had made sure it always would. Don't miss what's coming next. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Each tale hides a mystery waiting to be uncovered. Turn on notifications. Share this video with your friends and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps these true style stories alive. And trust